Exactly 41 minutes separated the precise moment the exterior electronic eyes of the residents went totally, yet deep inside the darkened residential layout, another highly sensitive device was still actively transmitting data. The house itself had witnessed everything, recording the exact sequence of the nightmare in microscopic lines of raw data, just waiting for someone to look beyond the physical blood on the porch and dive into the hidden network logs. The true narrative of what occurred was not written in the physical dust, but etched permanently into the silent network logs. The turning point in the investigation did not emerge from a physical clue found on the perfectly manicured lawn, but from a deep forensic dive into the remote cloud servers. Investigators finally requested the complete backend data logs for every single smart device connected to the residential network. When the digital forensic technicians aligned the timestamp data from the security systems and the medical monitors, a chilling and precise timeline of terror instantly materialized on their screens. This was the exact moment the entire nature of the investigation fundamentally shifted. The data logs revealed that the house had not simply failed to record the event, it had been actively, intentionally blinded. A surgically implanted medical pacemaker connected to a smartphone application relentlessly continued to broadcast a steady and rhythmic pulse. The security camera guarding the front porch did not experience a random technical malfunction. The network diagnostics confirmed a hard physical disconnect. At exactly 1:47 in the morning, reportedly, someone deliberately severed the power source to that specific camera. This was not a power grid failure, because the rest of the house remained fully connected to the local network. It was a surgical, targeted strike against the primary optical sensor of the property. But the intruder made a critical miscalculation regarding the layered nature of modern surveillance. While they successfully neutralized the external camera, they were completely unaware of the internal medical telemetry broadcasting from inside the victim herself. The back-end server data for the pacemaker application told a story far more horrifying than any physical evidence could convey. The logs clearly indicated that the pacemaker maintained a strong, uninterrupted connection to the nearby smartphone for an extensive period after the camera was violently disabled. The data stream showed the heart beating continuously, minute after minute, in the absolute darkness of the severed house. The physical heart of an 84-year-old woman was still steadily beating in the pitch black surroundings. The timeline proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that the victim was alive inside the residence while an unidentified threat was simultaneously present. The digital timestamps created an agonizing 41-minute window of sheer terror. From 1:47 until 2:28 in the morning, the victim and the intruder shared the enclosed space of that house. We do not know if there was a confrontation, if words were exchanged, or if the victim was entirely paralyzed by fear. The medical data simply coldly recorded a steady heart rate, completely indifferent to the psychological nightmare unfolding in the physical realm. Then, the timeline abruptly shattered. At exactly 2:28 in the morning, reportedly, the pacemaker application registered a catastrophic failure to communicate with the medical device. The signal did not slowly degrade as if the user was walking out of range. It terminated completely and instantly. The digital umbilical cord was ruthlessly cut. This simultaneous termination of both a physical security sensor and a deeply embedded biological monitor completely destroyed the initial theory of a confused, wandering elderly woman. A person suffering from dementia does not systematically dismantle external, hardwired surveillance equipment before experiencing a total failure of their internal medical telemetry precisely 41 minutes later. The telemetry indicates it beat while an unseen intruder navigated her private hallways. The sheer mathematical precision of the timeline proved that this was a highly organized, malicious intrusion. The data confirmed that whoever entered that property possessed a specific operational knowledge of the security grid. They knew exactly which wire to pull to blind the front of the house, but they missed the invisible digital pulse echoing from inside the chest. This revelation fundamentally changes the entire scope of the case. We are no longer looking for a lost grandmother. We are tracking a highly disciplined individual capable of executing a flawless extraction while completely manipulating a modern smart home ecosystem. But the most terrifying question remains entirely unanswered. What exactly transpired during those missing 41 minutes of complete digital isolation? To understand how the physical evidence completely contradicts the digital footprint, hit the subscribe button for Ellis Case Reports. It beat as the absolute silence of the early morning hours was irrevocably shattered. The federal authorities were now staring at a glaring black hole in the timeline. 41 minutes is an eternity during a violent home invasion. The silent pacemaker logs provided the exact boundaries of the nightmare, but they offered absolutely no details regarding the physical actions that took place within that dreadful window. The entire task force was forced to completely reevaluate every single piece of data. The absolute certainty provided by the digital timeline sharply contrasted with the chaotic and deeply confusing physical evidence slowly emerging in the days following the disappearance. By February 2nd, the local investigation had officially transformed into a massive federal kidnapping crisis. The involvement of the Federal Bureau of Investigation brought enormous resources, but it also highlighted the catastrophic errors made during the initial response phase. The pristine narrative of a flawless technological crime began to fracture as bizarre and contradictory elements surfaced. The first major complication arrived not from the crime scene, but through the media ecosystem. The medical logs confirm it continued to beat for exactly 41 agonizing minutes. Various national news outlets and local broadcasting stations suddenly began receiving a series of highly disturbing electronic communications. These messages claimed direct responsibility for the abduction and contained explicit demands for a massive financial payout. The alleged ransom notes outlined specific deadlines and threatened severe consequences if the monetary demands were ignored. However, behavioral analysts and cyber forensic teams immediately identified massive inconsistencies within these communications. The language used in the emails varied wildly in tone and sophistication. More importantly, despite the relentless demands for money, not a single piece of correspondence contained any verifiable proof of life. There were no current photographs of the victim, no audio recordings, and no answers to specific security questions that only the victim would know. The complete absence of this crucial evidence led federal investigators to a chilling yet highly probable conclusion. The ransom notes were allegedly cruel, opportunistic fabrications generated by malicious third parties actively attempting to financially exploit a highly publicized tragedy. This digital noise served only to severely distract the primary investigative teams, draining vital resources and wasting precious hours verifying entirely dead-end leads. Following the precise moment, the front camera wire was physically ripped from its socket. While the cyber division battled the influx of fraudulent extortion attempts, the physical evidence recovery team finally secured a tangible lead from the immediate vicinity of the residence. During a meticulous grid search of the property boundaries, technicians located a single discarded glove resting near the perimeter line. This was the very first piece of physical material that allegedly belonged to the suspected intruder. The item was immediately rushed to the state crime laboratory for advanced forensic processing. The initial results generated massive excitement within the task force. Biological material was successfully extracted from the interior lining of the fabric, but the optimism was violently crushed when the genetic analysts delivered their final report. The extracted sample was not a clean, isolated genetic profile. It was deeply degraded, mixed DNA. The biological material contained overlapping genetic markers from multiple unidentified individuals, severely complicating the analysis. In forensic science, a highly complex mixed sample makes it exceptionally difficult to isolate a single primary contributor for direct comparison against the national criminal databases. And then, at exactly 2:28 in the morning, reportedly, the health monitoring application registered a sudden and catastrophic loss of signal. The presence of multiple profiles suggested several contradictory scenarios. The glove could have been purchased secondhand, it could have been shared among multiple individuals, or it could have been deliberately contaminated to intentionally mislead the entire investigation. The physical evidence was proving to be just as deceptive and manipulative as the fraudulent ransom emails. The deeper the authorities dug, the more the case seemed perfectly designed to completely frustrate standard investigative techniques. Every single breakthrough was immediately followed by a massive, impenetrable wall. The blood on the porch clearly confirmed a violent physical trauma, yet the immaculate interior of the house completely denied any struggle. The pacemaker data definitively proved the presence of an intruder, yet the suspected perpetrator had managed to entirely evade the exterior motion sensors. The ransom notes heavily implied a financially motivated kidnapping. Yet the complete lack of proof of life strongly suggested a much darker, far more fatal outcome. The mixed DNA on the discarded glove offered a physical connection to the crime, yet the complex genetic overlapping rendered it virtually useless for immediate identification. The investigation was rapidly descending into a profound state of investigative paralysis. The digital heart monitor went entirely offline. The fragile human biology and the robust digital grid were severed simultaneously. The federal agents were drowning in a massive sea of completely conflicting data points. They possessed enormous amounts of highly specific information, yet they lacked the single unifying narrative thread required to tie the disparate elements together. The sophisticated technological surveillance system, the brutal physical evidence, and the chaotic digital extortion attempts were completely failing to align into a coherent picture of the crime. The authorities realized they were dealing with an adversary who deeply understood forensic countermeasures. The perpetrator had meticulously orchestrated a scenario that weaponized the investigation against itself, using the sheer volume of contradictory data to effectively camouflage their true identity and ultimate motive. The trail was growing incredibly cold, and the horrifying reality began to set in. The answers were not going to be found in the physical dirt of the crime scene or the fraudulent emails clogging the federal servers. The only path forward required them to completely abandon traditional police work and plunge back into the raw, unpolished back-end data of the tech conglomerates. The sheer complexity of a modern digital crime scene demands an immediate and flawless forensic response. In those 41 unrecorded minutes, a suburban property was violently transformed into an isolated island, invisible to the outside world, yet the reality on the ground during those critical initial hours was characterized by a catastrophic procedural collapse. When a high-profile individual vanishes, the first 48 hours are universally recognized as the golden window for evidence preservation. However, the command decisions made by Sheriff Chris Nanos and his rapid response units during that irreplaceable time frame fundamentally compromised the entire trajectory of the search. The fundamental error lay in the initial cognitive bias of the responding personnel. By categorizing the situation as a routine missing person incident involving a senior citizen, rather than treating the premises as the epicenter of a targeted abduction, the department authorized a massive yet entirely destructive tactical operation. Dozens of well-meaning deputies, search and rescue volunteers, and canine units were permitted to systematically trample the immediate exterior perimeter. They marched across the precise pathways the perpetrator utilized. They contaminated the surrounding vegetation where microscopic trace evidence is typically snagged. They effectively obliterated the fragile spatial relationships between potential outdoor clues. Dark, and the exact fraction of a second when the rhythm of a human heart faded from the digital medical network, yet perfectly capturing the terrifying final moments of a normal life through the cold telemetry of a singular medical tracking device. A true federal crime scene protocol mandates an immediate, rigid lockdown, establishing concentric zones of restricted access to prevent the introduction of foreign biological material and the destruction of existing footprints. Instead, the property lines became a chaotic staging area. The biological traces located near the entrance were documented, but the broader contextual canvas of the yard and driveway was irrevocably altered by the boots of the search teams. Every single tire impression that might have indicated the make and model of the suspect's vehicle was overwritten by the arrival of heavy tactical cruisers and emergency medical transports. Any microscopic fibers transferred from the assailant's clothing to the exterior door frames were potentially brushed away by the sheer volume of unprotected personnel entering and exiting the structure during the initial chaotic sweep. The sheer magnitude of this contamination cannot be overstated in a modern forensic context. This missing window of time holds the absolute darkest secret of the investigation, representing a terrifying void where traditional physical evidence vanishes and only digital ghosts remain. In an era where cases are routinely solved by transferring a single skin cell or a microscopic drop of perspiration, the failure to establish an immediate, hermetically sealed perimeter is practically unforgivable. The federal investigators were forced to confront a deeply unsettling reality. The physical manifestation of the crime had been unintentionally sanitized by the very people sworn to solve it. This physical breakdown explains why the physical search yielded absolutely nothing of substance beyond the initial compromised findings. When the gravity of the situation finally penetrated the command structure and federal agents assumed control, they inherited an entirely degraded physical environment. The local authorities had unknowingly erased the very breadcrumbs they desperately needed to follow. This systemic failure highlights a terrifying vulnerability in suburban law enforcement. The rapid evolution of criminal methodology has far outpaced the traditional training parameters of municipal responders. A perpetrator who executes a digitally silent extraction relies on the subsequent chaos of an unprepared police force to sweep away their physical mistakes. The suspect essentially weaponized the standard operating procedures of the local sheriff's department against them. With conflicting ransom notes, hidden back-end digital footprints, and a missing 84-year-old woman, the truth is buried somewhere in the timeline. The delayed recognition of the crime's true nature granted the assailant an insurmountable head start. They had hours to secure their captive, switch transportation methods, and vanish into the expansive interstate system while local units were still fruitlessly organizing local search grids based on a deeply flawed premise. The agonizing truth is that the physical clues necessary to crack the case were likely present during the first hour, but they were sacrificed to procedural inertia and a tragic lack of imagination. The federal cyber teams inherited a physical vacuum. The dirt, the pavement, and the surrounding foliage had been rendered forensically mute. To find the phantom who orchestrated this flawless disappearance, the investigators had to turn away from the contaminated soil and look upwards toward the vast, invisible architecture of the internet. They needed to bypass the local hardware and infiltrate the remote data centers where the memory of the house was permanently archived. If you want to follow the forensic evidence where it actually leads, subscribe to Ellis Case Reports. The local errors had burned the physical bridge, leaving the digital frontier as the absolute final avenue for answers. If you are fascinated by how institutional failures inadvertently protect sophisticated predators, subscribe to Ellis Case Reports as we delve deeper into the systemic breakdowns that allow monsters to operate undetected. The physical lens of the surveillance system was effectively blinded when the wire was severed, but the fundamental architecture of cloud-based security relies on a continuous, redundant flow of encrypted data. When a perpetrator physically destroys a piece of hardware, they incorrectly assume they are terminating the entire memory of the device. However, highly sophisticated systems do not solely rely on the local drive. They operate using a continuous buffering protocol, constantly pushing micro packets of visual information to remote data centers scattered across the country. The federal cyber forensic team understood that while the local network was dead, the remote servers in Silicon Valley might hold a phantom echo of the intrusion. They executed a massive, legally complex data extraction protocol bypassing the damaged router entirely and directly accessing the deepest backend storage archives maintained by the technology provider. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old and lived a life defined by quiet routines and predictable schedules. The process is incredibly tedious, requiring analysts to sift through millions of lines of encrypted code, searching for fragmented visual packets that failed to compile into a standard video file. For days, the decryption software churned through the raw binary data, attempting to reconstruct shattered digital memories, and then a monumental breakthrough occurred. Deep within a forgotten cache of temporary files, the algorithms identified a tiny, fragmented sequence of motion data. It was an incomplete transmission, a corrupted file that had begun uploading fractions of a second before the physical power was violently cut. The forensic technicians isolated the fragment and applied advanced neural network enhancement tools to stabilize the raw pixel data. Slowly, out of the digital static, a terrifyingly clear image materialized on the monitors inside the Federal Command Center. The recovered file possessed a highly specific timestamp. It was recorded at exactly 2:12 in the morning. This timestamp was a revelation. It fell perfectly within the terrifying window of silence, occurring long after the exterior hardware was destroyed, but before the internal medical telemetry was completely silenced. Her existence was meticulously structured around her family and her faith. The camera had not captured the initial approach, but an internal secondary sensor. One, the intruder had completely failed to identify and disable, had triggered a silent, momentary upload. The enhanced frame revealed the exact nightmare the victim faced. Standing squarely in the center of the visual field was an unidentified male figure. The tactical precision of his attire instantly confirmed the highly premeditated nature of the assault. He was fully concealed, wearing a dark, featureless mask that obliterated any identifiable facial geometry. Federal biometric analysts immediately began scaling the image against the surrounding architectural features to establish physical parameters. They calculated his height to be approximately 5 feet 9 inches. But it was the items he carried that truly elevated the threat assessment. In his right hand, gripped with clear operational familiarity, was a compact semi-automatic handgun. Slung tightly across his shoulders was a very specific piece of gear, a black 25-liter capacity backpack manufactured by the brand Ozark Trail. On the evening of January 31st, 2026, she concluded a perfectly ordinary day. This was not a random burglar interrupted during a theft. This was a heavily armed, tactically prepared operative executing a precise extraction protocol. The recovery of this single buffered frame completely shattered the perpetrator's illusion of total invisibility. He had meticulously studied the exterior wiring. He had successfully bypassed the primary alarms, and he believed he was operating in absolute darkness. He had no idea that a secondary hidden protocol was quietly uploading his exact physical dimensions and weapon system to a server farm 1,000 miles away. The identification of the specific backpack provided an immediate actionable lead for the logistics team. They began scrubbing retail purchasing databases and regional distribution logs, searching for the acquisition of that exact model in conjunction with tactical gear. For the family, viewing this reconstructed image was an experience of unimaginable psychological horror. The abstract terror of a missing relative was suddenly replaced by the visceral reality of an armed, faceless assailant standing inside the supposed sanctuary of their home. The digital resurrection of that single second in time proved that the perpetrator was methodical, armed, and completely unhesitating. At exactly 9:48 in the evening, a family member drove her back to her residence. The investigation was no longer a blind search through a contaminated physical landscape. It was a highly focused manhunt directed by the unblinking retroactive memory of the cloud. The digital ghost had been successfully captured. The physical hardware in the house had failed, but the invisible algorithms in the cloud had delivered a devastating counterstrike. This incredible digital exhumation proves that in the modern era, total erasure is a myth. You cannot simply pull a plug to disappear. The network always remembers. To see how these microscopic digital fragments are slowly woven together to hunt down untouchable predators, ensure you are subscribed to Ellis Case Reports. The miraculous recovery of the visual data provided a crucial tactical advantage, yet as the days agonizingly stretched into weeks, the fundamental objective of the operation remained completely unfulfilled. By February 5th, a heavy, suffocating reality began to settle over the Joint Task Force. Despite the deployment of unprecedented federal assets, massive digital dragnets, and continuous media coverage, authorities were forced to publicly confirm a devastating fact. They had received absolutely zero verifiable proof of life. The timeline is verified. The vehicle pulled into the driveway she safely exited, and the heavy automated garage door slowly descended, locking her securely inside. The subject had simply vanished into the American landscape without a single credible echo. The total absence of legitimate communication strongly suggested the most grim and fatal of outcomes. In complex, high-profile investigations, public speculation inevitably turns toward the innermost circle of the victim. Rumors, fueled by internet commentators and amateur sleuths, begin to wildly circulate, suggesting familial involvement or hidden financial motives within the victim's close relationships. To completely neutralize this toxic and distracting narrative, the commanding authorities took a definitive and highly unusual public stance. They officially and categorically cleared the entire family from any suspicion. Every sibling, every spouse, and every extended relative was subjected to rigorous forensic interviews, communication audits, and alibi verifications. The results were absolute. They were not co-conspirators. They were collateral victims enduring an incomprehensible psychological trauma. With the immediate family entirely removed from the suspect matrix, the focus shifted entirely to the unidentified tactical operative captured in the cloud data. Desperate to crack the impenetrable silence surrounding the case, the family authorized an extraordinary financial incentive. This was a completely routine drop-off. She was an elderly woman living alone. They announced a staggering $1 million reward for information directly leading to the safe return of the victim or the capture of the perpetrator. However, the structuring of this reward was not a standard public plea. It was heavily fortified with incredibly strict stipulations engineered by federal behavioral analysts. The reward protocols were designed to act as a massive filtration system, specifically calibrated to ignore the thousands of fraudulent tips and psychic predictions that inevitably paralyze high-profile tip lines. The money was securely placed in an escrow account, only accessible upon the physical verification of actionable intelligence that aligned perfectly with non-public facts held exclusively by the lead investigators. It was a calculated clinical maneuver, dangling a life-changing sum of money in the hope that loyalty among criminal associates is ultimately weaker than sheer financial greed. The reward stands as a monolithic monument to the ongoing desperation of the search. It represents the absolute limit of what private wealth and federal power can achieve when confronted with a perfectly executed disappearance. There is a deeply unsettling reality. We install cameras, motion tracking sensors, yet she was practically encased in an invisible web of protective surveillance and real-time medical monitoring. The physical crime scene was ruined by early procedural errors, and the digital trail ended abruptly at the edge of the cloud server. The entire apparatus of modern justice is currently completely stalled, waiting for an associate to betray the masked operative, or for the operative himself to make a catastrophic error. We know exactly what he wore, we know the exact caliber of the weapon he carried, and we know exactly what time he stood in that darkened hallway. We have the dimensions of the nightmare perfectly calculated, yet the central mystery remains violently unresolved. Where do you take an abducted individual when the entire country is watching, and how do you sustain total silence for months on end? The millions of dollars sitting in the fortified trust account represent a profound paradox. It is an astronomical sum of capital, entirely useless unless it intersects with human vulnerability or greed. The investigators are essentially waiting for the precise moment when the perpetrator's operational discipline fractures, her family, deeply protective and highly vigilant, had ensured her environment was optimized for maximum safety. Or when someone on the periphery of his life recognizes the specific backpack and decides that the money is worth a phone call. Until that specific piece of human intelligence materializes, the federal task force is locked in an agonizing holding pattern. The silence from the perpetrator is not just an absence of communication, it is a sustained, calculated act of psychological warfare against the family and the authorities. The digital ghost has been successfully identified by the servers, but the physical man and his elderly victim remain entirely swallowed by the vast, unforgiving darkness. What this case teaches us about the collapse of the golden window is a terrifying lesson in modern vulnerability. We exist in a paradigm where local law enforcement methodologies are fundamentally mismatched against the speed of high technology criminality. When a police department incorrectly evaluates a scene during the initial 2 hours, they are not simply losing time, they are permanently destroying the physical environment. The mishandling of the initial perimeter proves that institutional inertia is often a predator's greatest asset. But simultaneously, this investigation exposes a profound truth about digital forensic science. The physical destruction of hardware does not equate to the erasure of memory. The home was heavily outfitted with modern smart technology. The attacker believed severing a wire granted him total invisibility, completely failing to understand the complex architecture of cloud caching. The temporary motion buffer securely stored on remote servers acted as the ultimate uncorrupted fail-safe. Furthermore, the continuous transmission from the implanted medical device redefined the fundamental concept of a biological witness. Internet of Things medical technology functions exactly like a highly sensitive flight data recorder for the human body. It is an internal black box that meticulously logs the telemetry of terror, completely indifferent to the physical destruction occurring outside the flesh. We are no longer solely dependent on traditional markers like fingerprints or blood spatter. We are now hunting microscopic anomalies in encrypted data streams and recovering corrupted cache files. This specific case dictates that true security does not come from simply installing more cameras, but from understanding exactly where and how those connected devices permanently store their secrets. The intersection of procedural police failure and advanced digital resurrection makes this a landmark study in contemporary forensic investigation. Motion alerts were configured to notify relatives of any unusual activity at the perimeter. Our ability to solve these complex crimes now relies entirely on our capacity to accurately read the invisible language of the remote servers. The heavily armed operative who stepped into that suburban hallway believed the darkness would be his ultimate protection. He calculated the blind spots, he severed the physical connections, and he executed his plan with absolute, ruthless precision. He thought he left 0 witnesses behind. But he grossly underestimated the silent, unblinking vigilance of the modern digital ecosystem. If microscopic lines of code buried deep in a remote data center can successfully reconstruct the exact image of a masked phantom at 2:12 in the morning, long after the physical wires were cut, it forces a deeply uncomfortable realization upon all of us. As you sit in your home right now, surrounded by smart speakers, interconnected exterior cameras, and wireless health monitors, you must ask yourself a truly chilling question. How many invisible devices in your immediate vicinity are quietly recording the precise rhythm of your heartbeat at this exact second, silently uploading your biological data to massive... Her internal pacemaker was constantly uploading vital statistics to a secure cloud server designed to dispatch emergency medical services the instant any cardiac anomaly was detected. Technology is an impartial witness, always watching, always waiting in the background. Remember to double check your physical deadbolts tonight, and be sure to join us for the next complete forensic breakdown. Subscribe to Ellis Case Reports. She was physically alone in the house, but digitally she was surrounded by a constant protective overwatch. Her daughter, Savannah, a prominent national television anchor, and the rest of the extended family maintained constant communication. They built a system where absolute isolation was theoretically impossible. The sheer volume of digital safeguards made the property seem like a fortress. An intruder would need to be completely invisible to both human eyes and artificial intelligence to breach the perimeter undetected, and wireless health monitors fully believing they will construct an impenetrable digital fortress around our most vulnerable family members. The architecture of her daily life was a testament to the modern belief that if we wire our homes with enough sensors, we can permanently banish danger. Every window had a contact sensor. Every door had a smart lock. The temperature of the rooms, the status of the locks, and the rhythm of her heartbeat were all quantified, logged, and securely stored in remote databases miles away. It was an environment designed to provide absolute peace of mind. But this profound reliance on digital security created a dangerous blind spot. The system was flawless against random, opportunistic threats. It was designed to deter the common burglar or dispatch an ambulance for a sudden health crisis. It was fundamentally unprepared for a targeted, highly sophisticated intrusion by someone who understood exactly how the digital ecosystem operated. The technology that was supposed to serve as an infallible shield was merely a machine, and machines can be systematically blinded. We inherently trust the glowing blue indicator lights and the silent remote servers far more than we trust traditional deadbolts. As the garage door sealed shut at 9:48 that night, the house settled into a quiet, undisturbed state. The sensors glowed faintly in the dark. The wireless routers pulsed with steady data streams. Everything was functioning exactly according to its original programming. Yet, this overwhelming illusion of total security was precisely what made the impending breach so devastating. The family rested comfortably that night, looking at their phone screens, seeing the green check marks indicating the house was secure and the medical devices were functioning normally. They believed the technology was guarding her. They had absolutely no way of knowing that the very system designed to sound the alarm was about to become the silent, passive witness to a highly calculated abduction. The darkness completely enveloped the house, and the security grid, built with absolute love and profound technological trust, quietly began counting down the final hours of her known existence. Sunday morning arrived with an unsettling quiet. The date was February 1st. Technology, however, possesses a critical flaw. It only records the truth provided the physical wires remain undisturbed. For Nancy, she was a deeply faithful woman who religiously attended her scheduled church services. Due to her advanced age, she participated via a dedicated online live stream, a digital ritual she never missed. Her family knew her routine intimately. The computer would be logged on, the service would play, and she would be present. But as the morning progressed, a stark anomaly disrupted the established pattern. The family noticed her complete absence from the digital congregation. She had not logged in to the designated church portal. Furthermore, multiple attempts to reach her via telephone went completely unanswered. The digital silence from her end was entirely out of character. By 11:56 in the morning, the mounting anxiety reached a critical threshold. At exactly 1:47 in the morning, according to One News, family members immediately drove to the residence to conduct a physical welfare check. The exterior of the house appeared completely undisturbed in the midday sunlight. There were absolutely no shattered windows. The perimeter looked exactly as it had the night before when the garage door closed. But the illusion of normalcy evaporated the second they stepped onto the front approach. Smeared across the concrete surface of the front porch were distinct, undeniable traces of biological fluid. It was a grim, unmistakable visual. Fresh blood staining the entryway of an 84-year-old woman's home. The family immediately dialed 911. The emergency dispatch center received the frantic call just before noon. First responders arrived at the location, stepping into an environment that instantly confused the standard investigative protocols. The initial physical assessment of the scene yielded baffling results. The residence was empty. Nancy Guthrie was gone, An unidentified physical hand deliberately reached out and severed the hardwired connection to the primary security camera, actively guarding the main entrance. But the lack of physical disruption inside the dwelling was deeply contradictory to the violent evidence found on the exterior porch. A violent struggle leaves a distinct spatial signature. Overturned furniture, scattered personal belongings, broken glass, or scuff marks on the flooring. This house contained none of those indicators. Everything was perfectly in its designated place. It was as if she had simply evaporated into the ambient air. The initial responding officers walked through the silent hallways, their radios crackling in the quiet rooms, trying to reconcile the pristine interior with the bloody exterior. The immediate assumption, often the default in cases involving elderly individuals, began to circulate among the preliminary responders. The initial theory suggested a medical episode, perhaps profound disorientation, leading her to wander away from the property on her own. This early hypothesis completely dictated the initial response strategy. It shaped how the perimeter was managed and how the immediate vicinity was searched. It was a fatal miscalculation regarding the true nature of the incident. The surveillance lens immediately died. The network feed dissolved into static. The local authorities were completely unaware that they were not standing inside a home where an elderly woman simply became confused and walked away. They were standing in the precise epicenter of a highly coordinated, technologically sophisticated federal crime. The physical crime scene was essentially a sterile environment, meticulously wiped clean of traditional forensic markers. The intruder had not left behind the standard trail of breadcrumbs that local detectives rely upon. There were no obvious fingerprints on the doorknobs. There were no muddy footprints tracking across the carpets. The physical space was completely silent, refusing to yield any immediate answers to the frantic family standing on the front lawn. The initial patrol units spent crucial hours treating the immediate perimeter as a standard missing persons search area, totally failing to properly secure the interior of the property as a major federal crime scene. But while the physical realm offered nothing but a terrifying void, the invisible digital architecture of the house was holding a massive, terrifying secret.